Bona tarda, jo seré molt breu, no m'entretindré gaire. Bueno, saludo a los compañeros de Paga, que también están hoy algunos con nosotros. Y nada, para mí personalmente es un honor tener a Sally hoy con nosotros. Recuerdo la primera reunión que hicimos en el GAC, que yo era presidenta, que en la lista que tenía de guionistas que quería invitar para que vinieran a hablar de sus series, la número 1 era Sally, siempre lo ha sido. Yo soy muy fan de su obra. Supongo que la mayoría habéis visto sobre todo Happy Valley y Gentleman Jack, que son las últimas series que ha estrenado, pero a mí me gustaría remontarme a Coronation Street, a una miniserie que se llamaba Unforgiven, también con Suran Jones, a la magnífica serie de Scott and Bailey, que es de policías, y luego, bueno, las Tango in Halifax y las que ya conocéis, ¿no? Yo la admiro muchísimo, creo que es una guionista modélica por muchas cosas, sobre todo por esos personajes femeninos que ella desde hace más de una década pues, ha metido en los guiones y que son todos inolvidables, ¿no? Los personajes que ha interpretado Suran Jones en las series en las que ha trabajado con Sally. Y bueno, es que estoy encantadísima de que esté aquí. Todo lo que diga me lo voy a grabar a fuego y me lo voy a tatuar. Y nada, estoy muy contenta de que estéis vosotros también esta tarde aquí, ¿de acuerdo?
Hola a todos. Vamos a estar hablando unos 50 minutos o una hora. Si las preguntas que tengáis las podéis ir poniendo en el chat y al final pues iremos, pues se las transmitiré a Sally y haremos un poco turno de preguntas y podéis añadir más, no es que si no preguntáis durante la conversación tengáis que callar para siempre. Entonces pues vamos a empezar. All right, Sally. So perhaps to get us started, I'm going to start chronologically just because it feels a bit easier. And a lot of people here, there's a generation of Catalan screenwriters who do have the experience of working for the series that run more than once a week, like Coronation Street did, because the Catalan broadcasting system was pretty much modeled after the BBC. So there's always been a daily series running. And maybe you could start, because you wrote there for quite a few years, like 5 or so, if I remember correctly, what that was like, because the pace of that kind of series can be pretty relentless. And I think a lot of people might be interested to learn if that's the same in the UK, or how writing for such a long show as Coronation Street was like.
For me, it was a really good apprenticeship, really, in how to do the job. In that you met in a room full of 15 people at the time, all more experienced than I was, and I just learned a lot about storytelling. You know, for me, the hardest part of this job is story, the relentless need for story. You know, I can invent characters quite readily, and I can write dialogue very easily. But the hardest thing for me is coming up with stories. And so working on a long-running show like Coronation Street, with those fantastic voices around the table who for years and years and years had been developing this long-running story, was a real education. And I think when you work on a show like that as well, you just learn a real discipline where you know, deadlines, you really have to hit your deadlines. There's no getting around it. If you can't hit your deadlines, there's no point being there. So for me, it was a really useful. Well, it wasn't just useful; it was desirable. I wanted to be there. You know, it was, for me, it was a real, being asked to write Coronation Street was a real accolade in the 1990s. But looking back, you know, I've been writing my own original work now for over 20 years.
Indeed.
But I couldn't have done that without the grounding that I got on show, particularly on Coronation Street, where there were just some very clever people who knew how to invent stories that didn't just last a few weeks, but would last months and months and months, if not years. You know, that's a real skill to be able to develop those kind of stories. And it's hard work. It's really hard work. I'm just working on the stories now for Happy Valley 3, and it's kind of I'm at that point where it really does your head in, thinking, how can I make connections? How can I make this story twist and turn across 6 episodes? And it's hard work. It's always hard work. You know, you've really got to put the hours in. It doesn't come readily. It's you've got to work at it.
How are you doing with your writing under lockdown with the whole pandemic going on? Because some writers I've spoken to seem to find this absolutely, you know, invigorating, where you don't really have anywhere to go. So you just stay home and write. So how's that working out for you?
The first lockdown in March, I found my concentration really vanished. It suddenly seemed a lot more important to go outside and plant vegetables than write about Anne Lister. So it really affected my concentration to begin with. I mean, I think in the early days of the pandemic, we didn't, you know, none of us knew what it was going to be like, what we were dealing with, and there was a great deal of fear and worrying about whether you could actually, you know, get food and that kind of thing, which seems a bit silly now, but when it first started, you know, there was the panic about toilet rolls and that sort of thing.
Yes, that was the same in Spain.
So it really knocked my concentration for 6 for a while. I get up certainly in the summer. I'm not so much now when it gets dark. When it's dark later and comes dark earlier in the afternoon, but I normally get up about 5 o'clock every day to start work, because I know that's when my brain's at its best. That's when I can get more, you know, I can get a huge amount of work done if I start early. So I was getting up at 5 o'clock every day and really trying to put the hours in, but I found it really quite hard. And I spoke to my agent about it, and she said everybody felt like that. So I haven't spoken to any writers who said yes, it was wonderful, and as you have, I hadn't spoken to anyone who said they really found it helped them get on with it. I found completely the opposite. I found it really,
I guess it takes a certain level of being sheltered and privileged to just be able to see this as an opportunity to, I'm just going to go and lock myself up and do my writing. But I completely understand the uncertainty, I think, got to pretty much everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty reclusive anyway. My normal working week would be the equivalent of lockdown for most people. But I just found myself pottering around a lot. I found myself doing, like, the garden. The garden's been transformed over the last 8 months.
Well, lucky you to have a garden, though.
Yeah,
that's wonderful.
We are very lucky where we are. I must say I've thought that a lot throughout the pandemic. We are blessed where we live. We live in the middle of nowhere in Oxfordshire, and if I'd been in the middle of London or something, I think I'd have had a very different experience.
I thought it was funny what you said earlier about how characters and dialogue come easily to you, and it's the story that you find harder, because you often hear from other writers, oh no, if you have great characters, the story will just write itself. You know, you just have to, you know, make choices or put them in tough positions, and then the story will come all on its own. And I just thought it was really interesting to hear another side to that. It's like, yeah, you can have great characters and still don't really know where to send them.
Yeah, it's true that if you've got great characters, you know how they'd respond in any given situation. But it's finding those situations. It's finding interesting situations to put them in, and then finding those juxtapositions of story that give you help you construct a drama with peaks and troughs.
Of course. And then how do you go from Coronation Street, and I'm assuming you already had an agent at that point, to pitching your own shows? Is that a natural thing for writers, where if you've been, you know, down a certain path, at some point someone's going to ask you, hey, do you have something to show, or do you have something interesting to pitch?
Yeah, well, I worked when I wrote Coronation Street. It was made by Granada Studios, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was a big production company, and it was organized at the time in a way that there was kind of a system there whereby if they took you on board to work on one of their other shows, one of the more, the daytime soaps, or a children's show that I'd worked on called Children's Ward, and you did well, there was like a progression. Everybody wanted to get onto Coronation Street, and so there was a way of progressing, and they would keep, there were very good relationships there, and people would keep an eye on you, and if they sort of took a shine to you or just liked your work, you would be asked to do other shows as well. And then when I got onto Coronation Street, which was what I'd always wanted to do since I was about 12, was write Coronation Street.
That's wonderful.
But then when I got there, it was like, now what do I do next? And Kay Mellor worked at Granada at the time as well, and she'd just got Band of Gold greenlit, which was her, you know, massive BAFTA award-winning drama about prostitution, sex workers. And I kind of followed, she kind of took me under her wing, and I kind of followed her example really. And after, when I got onto Coronation Street, I thought, now I want to, what's the next thing? And the next thing was to get my own drama commissioned, my own original work commissioned in the 9 o'clock slot. So it was more bigger budget, a bigger slot, that kind of thing. So I pitched it to my executive producer on Coronation Street, who was Carolyn Reynolds at the time, and she commissioned it as an hour-long drama, and then we sent it to ITV, and after some toing and froing, they greenlit it. That was At Home with the Braithwaites, and
yes,
and fortunately it got made, and it, you know, and it did well. And I think by that point in my career, I'd written another pilot for an hour-long drama that hadn't taken off. But that wasn't my own idea. That was an idea that Carolyn had come to me with about the Mountain Rescue Service in the Lake District. And I wrote a first episode of that, but it didn't get taken up. But I was just lucky with the Braithwaites. It just seemed to be, you know, it's yeah, you know, it's timing often with
yes,
this.
it's one of those right idea, exactly,
which is not an exact science. It's just you know, serendipity, being in the right place at the right time,
definitely
with the you know, the right idea. So that got made, and it just did very well. It, you know, it got a big audience and it got good reviews. So I was, again, just lucky, really, lucky and working hard, you know, which I've always done.
And you said it was a sort of natural thing for young writers to sort of break in and start working on a show, and then you'd get moved to like bigger and bigger shows until, you know, Coronation Street perhaps being like the apex of that trajectory. Is that still how it is today, or what has changed in how you, a young writer, like if you were starting out today, how do you think things will go?
I don't know if it's, I think that's still a paradigm. That's, you know, ideally what you do. You would start by getting the experience of writing on an show, working with other writers, getting to know the business, and then aspiring to get your own work greenlit. I think, again, I was lucky at the time at Granada that there seemed to be a bit of a system in place for encouraging that. And I don't know how often that's true in TV. I think, you know, often it's just about using your own initiative and going knocking on doors and kind of making a nuisance of yourself and pushing your ideas forward, and not, you know, believing in them, and getting people to meet you and pitching things at them.
You have mentioned, I found it striking because you've mentioned two women in the author of Bands of Gold, and then Caroline, the executive producer at. Was that rare that you had women to look up to in terms of, were you, I guess I'm asking here about gender and being a female writer. Is there, I don't know how to phrase this, but were you aware of things being different? Was it tough as a female screenwriter? Are there many female screenwriters in the TV environment that you've worked with, or that you've, you know, made ties with? Because it definitely, I can't see a reflection of that in Spain, that we don't still have very powerful women in the TV industry, which I think is interesting.
You don't, or you do? No.
There are not that many names, no.
Okay. When I was worked at Granada, which was in the 1990s, I was kind of oblivious to it in the way that I think we all were in those days, that you kind of just accepted it was the way it was without actually thinking about it. And I think I was lucky to know not just Carolyn and Kay, but Sue Pritchard as well, who produced Coronation Street. And most of the writers were men. There was a room of like 15 of us, and there were 3 women in that group of 15, and the rest were men. And at the time, again, I didn't think a lot about it. You just kind of accepted that that's the way the world was. And it's only now that you think, oh my God, that's really bad. And I know it's different now. There are a lot more women in the business. But again, you feel like you can't be complacent about it. You can't assume that it's gonna continue like that. I think it's an ongoing situation that you've got to kind of keep on top of. I think I always gravitated towards women to build up relationships with, because it's less true now, but you know, when I started out 30 years ago, there was a lot of bullshit from men. And I always felt that women were more honest. I always felt that women would be a lot more straight with you. They wouldn't.
You mean with the feedback, or?
Yeah, and with being honest about where you were. And,
okay.
With things. I think the industry being very male orientated. There was a lot of it was about power rather than just interesting stories or the truth of a story. It was. I have worked with a number of men. I've worked with some really nice men, but I've never worked with a woman for whom it was about power rather than doing a good job. I think that's the difference.
And do you think, because I thought it was interesting how many of your stories, you've placed women in male-dominated fields, and I'm thinking of Scott and Bailey, where, I mean, it's not so rare anymore to see female policemen, but still, most cop procedural shows are male policemen, or even Jane Hall, which I guess takes your own experience, but at least seen from here, the experience of a bus driver, of a lady bus driver, is rather well, it's still a very male-dominated field, isn't it? And then, I mean, I guess the epitome of that is Gentleman Jack, obviously. Is that something that interests you, to put women in male sort of dominated or male-oriented, as you said, fields?
It's not a conscious decision to do that, really. I suppose I write about people in challenging circumstances, and I think it's the way the world is, that most fields are dominated by men.
That's true.
So particularly something like the police, and certainly the business world of Halifax in the 1830s was thrown on exclusively by men, apart from Man Lister. So I suppose it adds a certain heroism to the fact, it adds another level of stuff they have to deal with. It adds another level of challenge to what they have to go through. But it was really interesting talking to my police advisor on Happy Valley about the fact that it was, you tend to think, if you conjure up the idea, a picture of a police person, it tends to be a man rather than a woman. And I had some really fantastic conversations with her about how women police, if they're not big. And my police advisor is tiny. She's not, she's the same height as me and thin. And we talked about how a lot of policemen can police because they're big people you can argue with or fight with. Whereas a lot of women police officers aren't necessarily big. And she talks about how women have to police with their personalities. They have to police with their intelligence. So that was an interesting difference. And of course, that's much more interesting to write about than somebody.
I was going to say, how that translates into the page, obviously. Speaking of research, and I really want to go into the Gentleman Jack research, because I'm guessing that's just a whole trove to uncover there. But in general, how much research have you done for your more sort of true to life contemporary stories? Like you said, you had a police advisor, but in general, how important is that to you? How much is that a part of your process?
Certainly on Happy Valley and Scott and Bailey and Unforgiven, I did a huge amount of research. Getting to know police officers personally rather than just calling someone up and asking to spend half an hour with a police officer. That's useless. That's no good at all. So I was lucky on both Scott and Bailey. I got to know Diane Taylor very well, who was a police inspector who worked with the major incident team in Manchester. And then on Happy Valley, I spent a lot of time with Lisa Farrand, who's a constable with the West Yorkshire Police, retired. And just spending hours and hours, well, you know, not just days, weeks, talking to them, really get inside their heads, getting inside their worlds, so that you kind of know it backwards. And as I've said many times before, the really great thing about that is that the things they can tell me are much more interesting than anything I could make up.
I bet.
I mean, I learned so much about police that I knew nothing. I knew so little about how the police functioned before I met Diane and before I met Lisa. And then you get a real insight into the way they, not just the way they do their jobs, but the way they think and their worlds, you know, and it's a very particular world, obviously, and it attracts a very particular kind of person to do that job, because it's very dark, you know, it does go into very, you know, on a daily basis, you're dealing with some very dark and difficult things. And it made me realize it's a job I could never do. I can write about it from a safe distance, but to actually do the job that they did, you know, both of them had worked for 30 years in their separate police forces, and it changes who you are. You know, you just see such difficult things, and of course it makes great drama as well. But I couldn't have done what they did.
And I was just going to say that the kind of research you described, where you sort of try to get to know these policewomen individually as people and police, I'm wondering, are you looking for something, because obviously the kind of information you're going to get is much different than if you just call your local police station and say, hey, so what happens theoretically, you know, you find a body, what happens? Run me through the steps, you know. I'm guessing you're looking for something that goes at a completely different level than just police procedure.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about talking to Diane and Lisa was that they'll tell me things that are like really off the record. Whereas if I'd just got a polite chat with a police officer, they'd probably be on their behaviour and not necessarily tell me, you know, the more interesting stuff. And
did a lot of that end up making its way into your actual writing?
Oh yeah, because that's what's interesting.
Of course.
You know, you've got to write about what's surprised you, what's struck you, what's made you go, oh my God, I don't believe that. Because as I said, the things Lisa and Diane would tell me are things I could never have begun to. Just the way they do business, the way they conduct interviews, the depth and detail that they go into to conduct an interview. You know, the kind of interviews where they know what the answers are before they ask them, and it's how Diane used to describe a really well conducted interview as like being like a ballet. Where every move was choreographed, every response was anticipated, so to write scenes like that was really, it was just new. I'd never quite seen anything like that on TV before.
Fascinating. So now moving on, because I think everyone here is, I guess, the most recent, and the work that they're perhaps most acquainted to because it's the most recent is Gentleman Jack. And I wanted to ask, how does that come about? Was it you who initiated the let's write a series about Anne Lister? And if so, what makes you stop and say, hey, this Miss Lister needs talking about? Because I thought it was, when I first heard about the series being underway, there's a semi-famous on Spanish, on lesbian Twitter in Spain, there's a historian who writes these wonderful threads about sapphic relationships throughout history. And she has that's how I first learned a lot about Anne Lister, through one of her threads. And suddenly the series is coming out and everyone is like, oh my goodness, it's just how you told it, or no, this is not how you said it was. And I'm just wondering, and I thought it was suddenly this sort of niche part of history, and I think so many people felt seen all of a sudden. So what made you connect to Anne Lister and say, hey, these needs a story all of its own?
Well, I grew up in Halifax, so I'd always visited Shibden Hall from being a kid, from being really small. I'd always visited Shibden, and I kind of always knew who Anne Lister was, or it was a name I always knew. I knew the Listers as a done Shibden, and I knew that people didn't like talking about Anne Lister, and there was a secret, and it was all a bit sensitive. And I think I was a teenager when I found out that she was gay, and that's why nobody spoke about it. And it was all, again, just, you kind of didn't go there. It was not, she certainly wasn't somebody that to be celebrated at that time. And then, but I continued to be intrigued by her and tried to find things out about her, and it was very difficult to find anything out about her. This is before the internet, where you could just press a button and get loads of information. And it wasn't until Jill Liddington published her book Female Fortune in 1998 that someone sent me a copy, because my friend knew that I was interested, and she sent me a copy, and it was just wonderful. It was like everything I'd imagined Anne Lister was, just outrageous and brilliant, really clever, just really clever, and this extraordinary journal that is 5 million words, 26 volumes. It's just a phenomenal achievement, this diary, and it's largely unpublished. The books that have been published about Anne by Jill and by Helena Whitbread, they're fantastic, but they do actually represent a fraction of the diary itself. There's so much that hasn't been published. So I just always found Anne Lister really exciting and fascinating. And I first pitched a drama about her about 20 years ago.
Oh, wow. So this has been a long time in the making.
Oh gosh, yeah, it really has. And it got turned down just because she wasn't famous. Nobody knew who she was. And it was only in 2016, after Happy Valley had been so successful, that Charlotte Moore at the BBC asked me what I wanted to do next. And it was the first time I'd actually been asked what I wanted to do, rather than being invited in to just pitch things to see whether, they stuck or not. And I said I've always wanted to write about Anne Lister, and she just greenlit it like that.
Oh, I think that's everyone here's dream.
She didn't know a huge amount about who she was. She was still not famous. But that's been gold dust. That's been unique.
Of course.
Somebody has suddenly become massively famous who died 180 years ago. And the response we've had has been extraordinary. I can't begin to tell you how overwhelmed we've all been by people from all over the world. Just it's almost like she's become a saint.
Yes.
And people are visiting Halifax like it's a shrine.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that.
In droves, and hopefully next year, when the pandemic's, we've got over the pandemic, there's going to be a big event in Halifax called the Anne Lister Birthday Weekend. It was meant to happen this year, and of course it got cancelled, but thousands of people are coming from all over the world.
Is there some sort of trust or foundation organizing this for Anne Lister? Was this something that existed?
An organisation called the Anne Lister Birthday Weekend.
Oh, okay.
That's been created by Pat Escott, who's just the ultimate Anne Lister enthusiast. Now, not having heard of her till Gentleman Jack was on TV. So
but does the association predate the series?
No.
Oh, okay. They just, how wonderful.
Yeah, no, it's all, she's now got global fame.
That's absolutely delightful. I think that's every writer's dream, isn't it? Especially when it comes to history.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, Happy Valley was very successful. Tango was very successful. But Gentleman Jack has just done something amazing. It's unique what's happened, I think, because she's a unique character, and the way history has ignored her for so long because she was gay, and Halifax has kept quiet about her for so long.
And suddenly everyone sees her through your eyes.
Yeah. Well, but now we live in a world where we can celebrate someone irrespective of what their sexuality is. And she should have been respected before now. Her journal is a literary masterpiece. And now people are going to know that. And so many people from around the world can now really explore that. We've got so many academics now from all over the world who are studying her journal and doing their own transcriptions of her journal. And it's a unique situation. It's phenomenal.
So once you get, you do your, all systems go for your Anne Lister story. Did you already have an idea of how you wanted to approach this? And research-wise, how do you even begin to tackle, on the one hand, her humongous amount of this? I mean, it's inconceivable that, you could process all this. in a reasonable amount of time. And secondly, I'm guessing, even though history has kept quiet, there must be plenty of historical accounts about her. So how do you even begin to, make a coherent narrative? Or what was it? Did you already have a story in mind? Did you research and then let the, pieces fall into place?
To begin with, I mean, there aren't that many historical accounts of her because she just wasn't famous in her own lifetime. So I tend to use the diary as my only source because there's so much there that, and as you say, I'm on a timetable. I haven't got time to read more.
Yes.
And so when I first started in 2016, I was doing my own transcriptions of the diary. And then I was turning that into storylines and then turning that into a script. So it was a really massively time-consuming process. It was taking me like 3 months to write one episode. So I got Anne Chomer on board, who's my sort of senior consultant on the show, and she took over the transcriptions for season 2, well, and season 1, which helped speed up the process.
Of course. But
the biggest challenge really is, it's not a novel. It's not got a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's, a lot of it's very repetitive. It's never boring, even when it's repetitive and she's going into great detail about coal mining. It's never boring. But it's not drama. It's not always drama. A lot of it's primarily the journal was an aid memoir for her. In the 1830s, it was about seduction of Anne Walker, and then a lot of it was about her business dealings. So it's trying to find structures and shapes within the stories that are actually this. Jill Liddington describes the journal as an almost like a video recording. It's so detailed. It's almost like following around with a video record. It's like you can see her. You can, you hear every conversation. It's so detailed. It's so extraordinary. So the biggest challenge for me was that it was shaping a narrative out of what essentially isn't a narrative form. And then the other thing is, and I found this increasingly hard as I've written season 2, is leaving what to leave out, because it's all so fascinating. And at the end of the day, I've covered, season 2 is covers about 18 months in 8 episodes. So there's a huge amount that has had to go, that's been lost. And that's hard. That's the hardest part, is dropping anecdotes that are just gold dust. but sometimes it's like a shaggy dog story. I don't know if you've got an equivalent way of saying that in Spanish.
I don't think we do.
But sometimes she gives you a really exciting nugget and you think, oh, this is going to be really exciting, and then she doesn't mention it again, so you can't make a story out of it. So it's I mean, it's I feel very lucky to be the person who gets to do this, but it is hard. It's quite you feel like you're bending your mind into all sorts of contortions to turn it into a cohesive narrative sometimes.
So you haven't added anything in terms of fabricated, or you have in terms to, I'm thinking maybe to patch up things or to fill up a bit gaps in the narrative, or how's that?
I did in the first season. She doesn't often talk about a tenant. She talks about them in terms of collecting the rent from them. She talks about them if they need repairs doing to the houses. She talks about them if she employs them to do work for her. She occasionally gives you a little bit of tittle tattle, a bit of gossip, but it's quite rare for us to do that. And in the first season, we saw the Sowden family and the Hardcastle family, and I wanted to make it feel like it was about her world. So I gave them stories. I invented stories for them, but it quickly became apparent that there just wasn't room for me to make things up. So they've kind of, they ended up feeling that I was shortchanging them rather in the way their stories were dealt with. So when we came on to season 2, I decided I've rounded their stories off, but I've decided not to throw in inventions,
more material, because there's just more than enough, I guess.
Yeah.
That's what I guess it's so striking about this as this work of adaptation, is that it really is all there, and the hard work, I guess, is to sort of nitpick really what to choose and what to tell and how to connect the different storylines.
Yeah.
Is there anything, what you found when you faced the diaries in terms of like, oh, I'm going to write the story, let's see what the story here is. Were you at all surprised? Is there something, did you find anything that was unexpected or that completely went off rails of what you thought you knew about Anne Lister or about the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, it's constantly, there are surprises along the way. You know, the way she deals with people, the way she never shies away from a confrontation. I mean, she's constantly surprised, and I think that's why she's so compelling as a character. But often it's things that are quite banal that you just didn't know about. So like Anne Choma rang me up the other day. She's my advisor. And said, she was on the phone and she said, she wore glasses. She wore glasses. She was wearing glasses in 1828. And it's like, we didn't, you know, you've got this image of her not wearing glasses, and suddenly you find out that she was, she must have had a monocle. She talks about my glass, so she must have had a monocle.
Oh.
Because she, and no, it wasn't that, sorry, it wasn't Anne ringing up saying that. She said she was short-sighted because she found this bit in the diary where she said, I've got to, how did she word it? It was like finally admitting that she couldn't recognize someone till they were a few feet away from her. And you just go, oh my God, that's because I assume Anne Lister is perfect and had 20/20 vision, you see. And suddenly find out that she's short-sighted is quite a shock. But yeah, I mean, the diary's constantly, I mean, it is outrageous in the way that we all know that she had sexual relationships with women that she wrote about in great detail, and didn't shy away from that at all. She was very explicit about that, but that kind of ceases to be shocking after a while. It's, you kind of, you know, that's what the diary is. So it's those odd other little details, and just details about what life was like then as well, that surprise and take your breath away occasionally. Like I was reading where in season 2 we go on their honeymoon, where they walked in the Alps, and they tried to get at Mont Blanc and they couldn't because the weather was really bad while they were there. And she was up the mountain and they were being guided by they had 2 guides called David and Michelle. And one of them, Michelle, I think, told Anne Lister that over there was a particular mountain, and she argued with him and told him that it wasn't that. It was a different mountain. And it's things like that that are quite amusing and entertaining, where you think, he's a guide, he knows which mountain it is. And now we found out she's short-sighted, so she probably was wrong. But it's just little details like that that's it's so alive. I mean, the diary is so alive. It's like I don't think of Anne Lister as a dead person because she feels so alive in the journal.
And in a way, I think because I knew of Anne Lister, but I'd never even I hadn't approached the diaries at all. And I wonder if, because the series has this sort of tongue-in-cheek kind of way about it, where it's always like, ooh, what's Anne going to, what's she going to come up with next? And I wonder, and seeing you talk about it now, it certainly must come off the diaries that way, I'm wondering.
She was very clever, Anne Lister. She had a really fantastic brain, and she also had this fantastic, for her, life was for living. She was so positive-minded about the world and everything in it. And I remember Jill Liddington once telling me that she was one of those people who's like 3 thoughts ahead of everyone else in any given situation. She's way ahead of everyone else. So when we were constructing the drama, we always had this idea that you always have to keep up with Anne Lister. She's always ahead of you, sort of mentally and physically, so the camera's always running after her. And humour, I always think there's a lot of humour in the diaries. Sometimes it's often because you're reading between the lines. Like a relationship with a sister was terrible, and often when you read the diary and it's all from Anne's point of view about
of course
annoying and boring Marion is, but then you read in between the lines, you just feel sorry for Marion having Anne Lister. So there's a lot of I find it very human. It's very human. Again, reading between the lines, you just get a strong sense of her. She had a very healthy sense of her own self-worth, which I admire. I think that's a very good thing to have if you're capable of it. But between the lines of that healthy sense of her own self-worth, you often can't help taking the side of the person she's dealing with, you know, or if she's describing having had an argument with, you just feel sorry for them because you know she'd wipe the floor with them.
You completely thrashed them. So you mentioned an advisor. So have you, I'm assuming you've been working with historians and other people, and this is certainly not the first time you write history. You did that miniseries about the Bronte sisters. What are the challenges about writing about specific periods in history as opposed to contemporary? Because I always feel it's at the same time a constraint, but also it allows you to play, it sort of feels playing dolls a little bit. You know, you open up this little world of how things must have looked like. How is that, do you find that challenging, or is that?
I feel it's quite a privilege actually, because the two historical things I've written are about real people. They're not adaptations of novels. So the Bronte drama was about the Bronte sisters and Branwell, and this was obviously about Anne Lister, and they're real people. They're real people who I admire as well, importantly. And the first time I started writing for Charlotte to speak, I felt like a real, it felt like I was taking a liberty, assuming that I knew what Charlotte Bronte spoke like. And but it gives, you know, you have to be very respectful too, because these are people who really lived and who you don't want to present to the world. You know, you want to be fair and truthful, but I think, you know, you have, it's kind of a responsibility to present them fairly, and to present them as hopefully they would want to present themselves, but trying to be very honest about it as well. So I don't know what Anne Lister would make of the way we've presented. I'm sure she'd like Saran. But yeah, it's I've kind of yeah, I feel very privileged to be able to be in a position where you can try and bring these people to life.
Absolutely. And in what way have you leaned on historians and advisors to write for this? What kind of questions, like if you're working with your advisor, so what would a regular phone call or an email look like?
When I was working on the Brontes, I was working with Siv Jansen, who's a doctor of literature and specialises in female literature from the 19th century, and we would throw ideas around a lot. We just spent hours and hours and hours together, just, well, in Haworth, walking around Haworth, walking up on the moors, and she told me a lot about the literature, which I'd read the books, but she just gave me a whole context level of insight into it that I didn't personally have, and I wanted that to inform the drama. So that was very creative and very constructive. It was really it was very enjoyable process to have all those lovely intense conversations before I started to write the drama. It's slightly different on Gentleman Jack in that Anne is there primarily to transcribe the diary, but we do have interesting conversations about Anne Lister, about you know, what she was like, talking about scenes, about how, you know, whether something's credible or not, that if we take a bit of a liberty with how she responds to something, it's always good to know that what Anne's opinion of that is. But with Gentleman Jack, because it's a much bigger concern than To Walk Invisible was, we've got a whole team of people on board, who, you know, script editor and storyliners and that kind of thing. So I'll get into a room with about 5 other people, and we will talk with Anne as well, Anne Choma, and we'll talk through all the ideas and construct the episodes as a team like that. And they will have also read the diaries as well.
And then, of course, since you've also been a director on Gentleman Jack, how does, after the whole ordeal of tackling the diaries and deciding that the story, what was the process like for, how did everything inform, like the production design, because I'm guessing that's the other beautiful thing about historical. You can have, there's so, you know, how would she have dressed? How would she, I don't know. I mean, I feel something very exciting about that you had this control or this ability. I don't really like the word control, but this ability to see the whole thing through beginning to end. And I'm guessing, how did your vision of Anne after going through her work inform how you wanted to, how you wanted to translate the writing to what you put in front of the camera?
Well, I mean, really, it was just about talking to the heads of department in things like design and costume, and the DOP, Matt Gray. It was just having really detailed conversations with them, and sort of taking them to Shibden and sort of inculcating them with my enthusiasm for it, which they all got. They all loved Anne Lister straight away. There was no problem.
Who doesn't?
Getting them to engage with the world. And of course, because we knew we were going to film at Shibden, that was already available to us. We made, Anna, Pritchard, who designed it, made choices about the difference between Shibden, which is very old and dark, and Crow's Nest, which is very Georgian and light and symmetrical. And so there was that fantastic contrast between those two worlds. And then Tom Pye, who came on to do the costumes, he again just really, really engaged with Anne Lister. And the fact that Anne Lister always wore black, he just has taken that to every extreme you can imagine. It's brilliant. And then in great contrast, the way the other women of that sort of period were dressed in sort of more Jane Austen,
yes,
Jane Austen
with the gowns and
styles, and the Empire line dresses and the huge sleeves and that sort of thing. So there was that fantastic contrast with Anne Lister. And then the DOP, Matt, we talked a lot about how to shoot Anne Lister.
I was going to say, because there's a very particular light always falling on her. And there's, when you said about the contrast with how especially the other female characters dress and conduct themselves, and that there's always, the photography so beautifully highlights that sort of,
Well, we talked a lot about, we always use Steadicam. We had a Steadicam available every day because we wanted to capture that energy. And so we all talked about keeping the camera very mobile. So it was always, the camera's always doing something. It's not just sitting there. Even if it's a very slow push and it's still working, it's still doing something. We always shot well below the eye line on Saran, so she looked, statuesque and magnificent as often as we could. We wanted it to look filmic, and we wanted it to look painterly as well. So we talked a lot about Gainsborough's portraits, the picture of Mr. and Mrs. I've got it on my wall. I don't know if you can see it up there. Mr. and Mrs. Andrew.
Oh yeah.
We talked about that kind of portraiture where you've got whole body length figures on the screen for your nice big wide shots. Because talks as well about how people have such big tellies now. It's like
yes,
you're not making images for small screens anymore. So so there was a lot of conversation about capturing the energy, Anne Lister's energy. Yes. That was the big thing for us. And a mental energy as well as a physical energy.
I'm guessing it's nearing 7, so I'm going to ask one last question and then open up the floor for questions from the audience. So you mentioned you were working on Happy Valley 3, and you're obviously still working on Gentleman Jack. Is there anything else that's new in the works for you?
Yeah, I've got a lot of I've got so many ideas at the moment, and just not enough time to get them down in black and white.
For example, just if you would care to share.
I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about.
Oh, okay.
But
right.
there's I've got a lot on.
Okay, let's leave it at that. I'm going to phrase this differently. If you could write about another historical character for your next project, who would it be?
Well, I
Oh, okay. You see, I got it. Okay, so you are writing about.
I am writing about Amy Johnson, which I've said in other interviews. So I'm trying at the moment to work on I am working on a film script.
Okay.
About the aviatrix.
Yeah.
But
beautiful.
I just haven't got time to get on with it at the moment, which I regret. But that's what I'm trying to get on with next.
Okay, so I'm opening up the floor. Si us plau, si voleu fer preguntes és el vostre moment.
Les podeu tant escriure per escrit com si algú vol treure el micro i fer-la de viva veu. Endavant.
No cal que sigui en anglès, vull dir, com us sigui més còmode. No, I can't tell if people are busy typing or...
Hi, I have a question.
Hello.
Yeah, okay. You mentioned earlier that you had a police advisor, well, two of them.
Yeah.
And I would like to know, how can you get, did you get them to talk to you so much?
Well, the one was
so long.
To begin with, I rang a police, my researcher rang a police station, and I went to this police station and talked to someone, and it was hopeless. It was really difficult. And eventually a friend of a friend put me in touch with this police officer, Diane, who I've talked about. And we just went out for a drink, and I just got to know her really well. And that was the best way to do it, was to get to just become friends with someone rather than think of it as research. It was more like befriend someone and just spend hours and hours and hours going out drinking with them.
Okay.
That's the best way for me. And then again on Happy Valley, when I met Lisa, she was actually, I already knew her. She was somebody I'd been at school with. And again, it became more a social relationship than a fact-finding thing. So I think the only way to do that is to get to know someone really well and to spend a lot of time with them. I think that's the only way to do it.
Is it always like that? I mean, for all the projects, does research...
I found all the research-based projects I've done, I just end up becoming really good friends with the researcher. Like Anne Choma, who's my researcher on Gentleman Jack, we literally ring each other up at midnight. We literally ring each other up in the middle of the night because we know that's okay to do that. We've become such good friends that that's the way it is. But I did have a researcher earlier on who was very rigid about when I rang her up and when I couldn't ring her up, and that just doesn't work. Especially, you know, when you're writing a script, if you need an answer, you need it now. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you just can't move forward. So I've always cultivated those relationships, usually because I'm passionate about something and I just need, you know, I need everything that person has. So I just naturally get to know them really well. But it's certainly the best way to get somebody who you can be really close to and who you can just spend a lot of time with, and who will, you know, tell you things that they might not tell other people.
Yes. We have another question from Angel, who says, if you could talk a bit about the treatment of violence in Happy Valley, because you've gone into it a little bit, but he found it really fascinating to portray this tough as nails cop without having her recur to violence.
Yeah. Well, again, it came from Lisa, the idea that women have to police with their personalities. You know, their strength isn't their first resource, because they're not necessarily that strong. I mean, they're trained and they know how to use the we've got, but they wouldn't resort to it readily. They would tend to try and talk people out of things rather than sort of lean on them to desist doing things. But when I shot the scene in the cellar where there was the big fight in season 1, when Catherine got badly beaten up, it was a lot more graphic. The first cut was a lot more graphic, and I was asked by the BBC to pull it back. You know, for that reason, that, you know, we don't want to show stuff that's too graphic. But at the same time, again, Lisa, the advisor, was, I talked to her a lot about that before we shot it, and she said, it's, you know, this is what happens. You when you do this job, you do risk life and limb. You do get beaten up, and she's been beaten up twice in the course of duty. And so for her, it reflected the truth of the job. It reflected what it is really like. And she felt that we got some criticisms, you know, that you shouldn't show violence towards women on television, which I understand. But Lisa's answer to that was, but that is what happens to female police officers. You know, if you are a female police officer, you have to go out and do your job, and you have to risk that happening to you. And she thought it was wrong not to show that can happen. So it was, you know, I hope would never do anything gratuitously or show something that was in any way glorifying violence. I quite like the idea. I watched it again the other day, actually, because I was just prepping for starting to work on season 3. And I found myself crying watching that again. And what made me cry was when Anne Gallagher, who's the one who's been kidnapped, has the presence of mind to help Catherine up the stairs and get her outside. And I found that quite uplifting, that this girl who's been brutalized for 5 days had what it took to think about the other person as well as herself. So I found that quite cathartic.
We have another question here about Gentleman Jack. If you could go a little bit into your professional relationship with Saran Jones.
Yeah, well, it's the first time I'd worked with Saran as a director. I'd worked with her on 3 other projects, Dead Clever, Unforgiven and Scott and Bailey, but I hadn't directed on those. So I didn't actually know her terribly well until I directed Gentleman Jack. So it was a real positive journey, I think, for both of us. I think we both got a lot out of it, and she loves rehearsing and I love rehearsing too. So, you know, in telly you don't get a lot of rehearsal time, but we both wanted it, so we asked for good rehearsal time, and we spent ages in a room in Holborn rehearsing while she's, you know, to create that character, because it was quite a journey creating the voice, for her to find the right voice, for her to work on the physical mannerisms, because her performance of Anne Lister is quite a long way away from where Saran herself is. It's, you know, it really is a big performance, but it's also very subtle and detailed as well. So it was really good fun. It was really exciting spending so much time together and just spending so much time thinking about Anne Lister and how to recreate Anne Lister in a way that was truthful but entertaining as well. So, you know, we kind of made a conscious decision to go down the route of presenting Anne as this quite swashbuckling.
Yes.
You know, you could easily present her as more bookish and more kind of I don't know, there's so many aspects to Anne Lister. You kind of have to pick and choose which ones you're going to highlight. And we really wanted to get this sort of swashbuckling, captivating, cool Anne Lister.
There's another question, but I wanted to ask, after season 1, has the way you write Anne Lister changed because you know that Saran is going to play it?
No, because I knew Saran was going to play her whilst I was writing season 1. So
okay.
I'd written 3 or 4 episodes when Saran came on board. I mean, for me, it was quite hard writing it before I knew she was on board, because it always helps me if I can see who's going to,
yes, and
hear their voices as well. So like when I wrote Happy Valley, I knew I wanted Sarah to play Catherine, so I wrote it with Sarah's voice in my head. So it's always easier when you know who's going to do it. So certainly from that point of view, season 2 was easier, knowing what Saran would probably bring to it and what she would do.
We have a question here from Victor, who asks, if whether you always have talent previously attached when you're pitching new shows?
You don't necessarily have them attached. You'll pitch who you want to play, who you've got in mind, because that helps put images in people's heads.
And does that wish list often come to life?
Often it does, yeah.
Oh, nice.
Not always, but often, yeah.
And then another question from Carmen, who wants to know if have you thought of making more seasons of Scott and Bailey?
No. I
don't know if you can see her, but she's absolutely crushed.
I only wrote 3 seasons, and then Amelia took over season 4. Because I kind of I felt like I'd done everything I could do with Scott and Bailey, but it did go on for 2 seasons actually after I left. So I mean, I wouldn't. Well, I might revisit it. Who knows? But it's not top of my list at the minute. But I mean, it could come back. It certainly could come back. I don't think did anyone die at the end of it? I don't know.
Did they, Carmen? No,
they didn't. So somebody could bring it back, but it might not be me.
We have another question from Puri. She says, I'd love to know if you start writing dialogue before characters or storyline are fully developed to find out who they are.
I don't do that because I think it's the short route to a waste of time. I think you've got to know who your characters are and what your stories are. I always do a really detailed scene breakdown before I start writing any dialogue, because I think that writing dialogue is the icing on the cake. I think writing dialogue is fun, is the fun bit. But it only really works when you know what the stories are and who the characters are. So I think sometimes you can have a crack at writing the dialogue, but for me, it doesn't work until you've got all your building blocks in place.
This ties in with a question that I had, which is, in your process, do you have other techniques or other exercises that you do to explore these characters, or do you just sit down and just crack the story nut until you have it and then take it from there?
I tend to just write a lot. That's what I'm doing at the moment. I'm at that stage with Happy Valley 3 where I'm just writing and writing and writing anything and everything I can think of to do with the characters and to do with the stories and to do with where they're at. And that for me pushes things forward. It makes me confront things that I haven't dealt with in terms of what the blocks are in the stories, where the gaps are, how these stories might interact with one another. So for me, it's just about pouring out a load, just sitting here typing away all day, writing tons and tons and tons of garbage, essentially. But it isn't garbage. It all comes. It's all useful. It all comes back, and it's all. The devil is in the detail, and if you don't put it in at the beginning, it's not going to transfer onto screen.
And then what do you write? Is there any specific form that you find more helpful, like I don't know, inner monologue or novelization of possible stories? How does that work for you?
Once I've got the stories all written out, I then do a scene breakdown, and again that'll be really, really detailed. And then when everybody's seen that and is happy with it, that's when I sit down to do the script, and that's kind of when the magic starts. That's when things occur that I hadn't really imagined. That's when it's only when people start speaking that you suddenly realize you can actually do anything you want. But I think as long as you put all that groundwork in, all that homework, all that background, that's when you can really go off on one.
And then we have another question from Paulo. I want to know the difference between projects where you're only the writer and the project where you're also the director. And what do you prefer? In which specific ways does it affect the final product? And thank you for the great talk.
I think I've always got frustrated in the past when other people have directed my work, partly because I've always wanted to direct myself. And I've not had time until recently to do that. And so I've always got frustrated because there's always something they've misinterpreted or misunderstood or just done in a very different way from how I saw it. And you know, in a way, that's what directors are for. They are there to come and give their kind of spin on it. But I've often found that quite difficult. I often have enjoyed it too when they've come up with really good stuff. But just a lot of the time, you're seeing stuff on screen, and you think that's just not, you know, it could have been a lot better than that. So, because I have got the director's gene, you know, I do want to do that. I want, and it is a great privilege of being able to see it all through, and you know, you're very dependent on a lot of other people to achieve that, but at least you're the ones kind of steering the ship, and you're the one making choices about what things will look like and how things will appear and that sort of thing. But having gone through that process now, I'm reconciling myself to the fact that I probably am going to have to work with directors just because it's so time consuming.
I was going to say.
Yeah, it really is massively time consuming. Enjoyable as it is, it's like the enjoyable bit is the tiny bit of working with the actors and getting the shots done. And there's so much prep involved that's so massively time consuming. It's really impacted on the amount of time I get to spend writing. So at the moment I'm having a writing phase, which is why I'm not directing Gentleman Jack, and I am writing Happy Valley. But I hope, having said that, I have got some directing ahead of me still. I hope I don't, when it comes to the crunch, I'll be going, oh no, I'd rather stay at home and write. I really do. I love directing. I mean, there's nothing like it. It's extraordinary. It's a really, it's odd because writing is such a lonely and social job, and directing is a very sociable job. It's a very, you know, you're surrounded by other people all the time.
And it's also a big trust fall, isn't it? It's trying to explain to people what you want them to do and hoping they'll understand exactly what you mean. Yeah,
but it's very rewarding, you know, when you're achieving, you know, great shots with this massive team of people. It's just very exciting.
It is. Yeah. I guess it's very exhilarating, right? That this is all when you were writing alone, holed up in your room, and now it's all coming alive.
Yeah.
We have another question from Carmen about what your opinion on how you see the future of British fiction in the big networks like BBC, ITV, considering how we have this now suddenly these streaming platforms have become big players in the game. And that was also something that I wanted to ask, because we're seeing such extraordinary fiction coming from Britain lately. And I was thinking, because I was reading a little bit about you and I saw you'd worked with Steve Pemberton in the past, and it's every time we're big fans of Insight Number 9 here in my house. And I just found it extraordinary that they keep, there's this phenomenal series that keeps just wanting to entertain and wow people episode after episode. And we're seeing, and it's just one example of things that are happening in Britain that are very exciting. So I wonder, what's your take on the environment where you're working at right now?
I mean, to me personally, it feels very exciting. It feels very stimulating. It feels like suddenly TV isn't the poor relation to film anymore. It's the other way around. And it feels to me that there are so many platforms and so much stuff out there now, that it feels like everyone's having to raise their game. And, suddenly British productions have access to more money because we're doing co-pros. And, to realise Gentleman Jack on the scale that we have, 5 years ago, that would not have happened. And it's very exciting that, we're living in this world where anything seems possible. It's, there's some fantastic invention out there. And it raises everyone's game, I think.
Hi ha alguna pregunta que algú vulgui fer de viva veu? Let's see if we have anyone who wants to ask directly. És la vostra última oportunitat.
I have another one.
Dale.
Yeah. Yes, you were talking about time. So if you could give us a hint about what are the amount of time you devote to each part of the writing process? I mean, how time do you spend, for example, for Happy Valley? How much time do you work on the characters, or then on the plot, and then on the dialogues and so on?
An average episode of Happy Valley, once I've sorted out the initial storyline document, would be 4 weeks, and I would spend 2 weeks doing a really detailed scene breakdown, and then I would probably spend 2 weeks actually writing the script.
Okay, that's for a 60-minute.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So.
Yeah, but as I say, with Gentleman Jack, it was taking me like 3 months to write one episode. It's a very different process.
Because that's where all the research came in, and I guess transcribing must have been plenty of hard work.
As Last Tango is the same as Happy Valley, because there's no research involved in that.
Mm-hmm.
Bit of sheep farming research, but apart from that.
Did you befriend lots of sheep just to, like you did with policemen? Well, with police women.
Just a sheep farmer.
Okay.
But not quite as intensely as them.
Is there any other question? Teniu alguna altra pregunta? Okay, well, I think we covered everything. Thank you so much, Sally. This was such a treat.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to give the floor back to Pau, because I think he needs a few words he wants to say before we call this off.
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much, Sally, for being here with us today. And, well, I'm going to just switch to Catalan. Volia agrair-vos a tots l'haver estat aquí, dir-vos que aquesta xerrada estarà disponible més endavant subtitulada i, sobretot, donar moltes gràcies al Serielizados Fest per fer possible que la Sally hagi pogut estar avui amb nosaltres. So, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sally, for being here again. Wish you great luck with the writing of the third season of Happy Valley and with everything. I'm gonna just shut down the Zoom. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.